September 8, 1943. Corporal Thomas "Bull" Mackenzie lay motionless in the rotting vegetation of New Guinea's Finisterre Range, watching a Japanese observation post through his Springfield scope. 47 hours without sleep, 6 days without a confirmed kill. The jungle breathed around him like a living creature, and somewhere in that breathing darkness, an enemy sniper had killed 11 American marksmen in 9 days. Each one died the same way, one perfectly placed shot, then silence. The Japanese shooter never revealed his position, never made a sound loud enough to triangulate, never left evidence except American bodies cooling in the mud. Bull had watched 3 of those men die, watched their muzzle flashes bloom like fatal flowers in the pre-dawn darkness, watched the answering Japanese bullet arrive before the echo faded. The math was brutal and simple. Every American shot announced a position, every position became a grave. But pressed against his rifle stock was something the Army hadn't authorized, something his commanding officer had explicitly ordered him to dismantle. Something that violated 3 different field regulations and would probably earn him a court-martial. A device built from salvaged aircraft parts and scavenged metal that did the impossible. It made his rifle whisper instead of scream. In the next 6 minutes, Bull Mackenzie would fire the shot that changed sniper warfare in the Pacific. He would kill a target no American had been able to touch. And he would do it so quietly that the Japanese soldiers standing 10 feet from the body wouldn't know where death had come from. This is the story of an innovation they tried to bury, and the man who refused to let silence become his enemy. Before we continue with this story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about World War II combat innovation, I want to ask you something. This channel exists because of viewers like you who believe that some histories deserve to be heard, even when they've been classified, buried, or deliberately forgotten. If you're someone who values these untold stories of ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now. Every subscription tells YouTube that these stories matter, that the men who fought in mud and blood and silence deserve to be remembered even when their own government tried to erase them. And here's what I want you to do right this second. Smash that like button. Not because it helps the algorithm, though it does, but because it's a small way of honoring men like Bull Mackenzie, who risked everything, including military prison, because they couldn't watch their brothers die following orders that didn't work. These men didn't fight for medals or recognition. They fought because someone had to, and the official solutions were getting people killed. Now leave me a comment telling me what country and city you're watching from. I want to know where our community is spread across the globe. Are you watching from Atlanta, Sydney, London, Manila? Drop your location in the comments. Last week we had viewers from 43 different countries, and I want to see if we can beat that record. Because these stories aren't just American history, they're human history. They're about what happens when individual courage meets impossible circumstances, when innovation is born from desperation, and when the only thing standing between survival and massacre is one man's refusal to accept that the current way is the only way. So, drop that comment, hit subscribe, slam that like button, and let's dive into a story that the Department of Defense kept classified for 37 years. A story about sound, silence, and survival in the green hell of New Guinea. Thomas Mackenzie had never intended to become a soldier, much less a sniper who would revolutionize combat tactics in the Pacific theater. He'd grown up in Butte, Montana, the 3rd son of a copper miner who died of silicosis when Bull was 14. The nickname came early, not because he was large, though at 6'2" he had size, but because once he set his mind to something, he was immovable as a bull facing a matador. His mother raised 3 boys on a seamstress's wages, and Bull learned early that survival meant paying attention to details other people missed. The stitching on a torn jacket that revealed which seam would fail next. The sound of his younger brother's cough that meant pneumonia was coming. The specific rattle in the mine company truck's engine that meant the brake line was about to fail, which it did, saving his uncle's life when Bull refused to let him drive it. He enlisted in January 1942, 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, walking into the Butte recruitment office with a determination that impressed even the hard-bitten sergeant behind the desk. Bull wanted infantry, wanted to face the enemy directly, wanted to make the Japanese pay for what they'd done. But the Army had different plans. At boot camp in Fort Lewis, Washington, his rifle qualification scores caught attention, not because they were perfect, but because they were consistent. Bull didn't have the highest score in his company. He had something better. He never missed by more than an inch, never rushed a shot, never let emotion affect his trigger pull. The range instructor, a grizzled veteran of the First War, pulled him aside after the third qualification. "Most boys shoot angry," he said. "You shoot patient. That's rarer than you know." By September 1942, Bull was at sniper school in Hawaii, learning the craft that would define his war. But something troubled him from the beginning, something that none of his instructors seemed to address adequately. Every shot announced your position. The manual said to shoot and move, but in jungle combat, moving meant noise, and noise meant death. He watched training films of European snipers operating in open terrain where relocation made sense. But New Guinea wasn't Europe. In New Guinea, the jungle was so dense that moving 50 yards could take an hour. The vegetation was so thick that visibility beyond 30 feet was rare. And the Japanese had learned to exploit this terrain with a patience and discipline that was killing American marksmen at an unsustainable rate. Bull arrived in New Guinea in March 1943, assigned to the 32nd Infantry Division, operating in the Finisterre Range. The terrain was a nightmare, mountains rising nearly 10,000 feet, covered in jungle so primeval that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Rain fell in sheets that turned the ground to sucking mud. Insects carried diseases that killed more Americans than Japanese bullets. And woven through this green hell was an enemy that had spent months fortifying positions, digging tunnels, creating killing zones that turned every advance into a calculated massacre. Bull's first combat operation was a disaster that taught him everything the training films had left out. His platoon was tasked with eliminating a Japanese observation post that was directing mortar fire onto American positions. Intelligence said it was lightly defended, maybe 6 soldiers. They were wrong. It was a fortified position with interlocking fields of fire, and Bull's platoon walked into an ambush that killed 7 men in the first 30 seconds. Bull survived because he'd been 20 yards behind the main group, had seen a flash of movement in the canopy that made him freeze. While his platoon died in the kill zone below, he pressed himself into the roots of a massive tree and didn't move, didn't breathe, became part of the jungle. The Japanese soldiers emerged from concealed positions, checked American bodies for intelligence, then melted back into the vegetation. Bull remained motionless for 6 hours, waiting for darkness, learning the most important lesson of his war. In this jungle, invisibility was worth more than firepower. When he finally crawled back to American lines, his after-action report was 3 words long. Ambush. Everyone dead. Sorry. His lieutenant, a green officer from Ohio who'd been at the front for exactly 11 days, wanted details. Bull gave him the only detail that mattered. They knew we were coming before we knew they were there. That night, unable to sleep, Bull thought about sound. The jungle was never silent. Insects, birds, rain, wind through leaves created constant noise. But underneath that natural symphony, certain sounds carried meaning. The specific crack of a breaking branch that meant human weight. The change in bird calls that meant movement. And most importantly, the distinctive report of an American Springfield rifle that told every Japanese soldier within a half-mile exactly where to direct return fire. Bull had grown up in mining country, where sound meant survival. A rockfall had a different sound than a controlled blast. A failing support beam creaked in a specific frequency. Men learned to hear danger before they saw it. The same principle applied here, but reversed. The Americans were making too much sound, and it was killing them. Over the next 4 months, Bull developed a reputation as the soldier who always came back. Not because he killed more enemies than others, his confirmed kill count was modest, 15 in 4 months, but because he never took unnecessary risks. He would spend days in position, observing, learning patrol patterns, identifying targets. Then one shot, perfectly placed, followed by absolute stillness for hours until he could extract safely. Other snipers thought he was too cautious. Officers complained he wasn't aggressive enough. But Bull was learning something they couldn't see. The Japanese sniper who was hunting American marksmen operated on the same principle he did. Patience, observation, and one perfect shot. The difference was that the Japanese shooter had something Bull didn't, a way to kill without announcing his position. The breakthrough came in July 1943, when Bull was reassigned to a position overlooking the Ramu Valley. His new spotter was a kid from New Jersey named Eddie Calabrese, all of 19 years old, nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm. Eddie had been a radio technician before the war, had a mind that understood frequencies and waves and how sound traveled through different mediums. During their 3rd day in position, watching a Japanese supply trail, Eddie said something that changed everything. "You ever notice how their shots don't echo the same way ours do?" Bull had noticed. He'd been trying to figure it out for months. Japanese rifle shots had a flatter sound, less of that distinctive crack echo that American Springfields produced. Eddie continued, working through the problem aloud. "It's like they're dampening the sonic signature somehow, maybe wrapping the barrel or using a chamber that redirects gas expansion. I don't know the mechanics, but the physics makes sense." Bull turned that idea over in his mind for 3 days. On the 4th day, he asked Eddie a question that would change both their lives. "Could we build something that does the same thing, make our rifles quieter?" Eddie's response was immediate. "Probably violate a dozen regulations. Officers would lose their minds. But yeah, theoretically, if you could disrupt the gas expansion pattern, redirect the pressure wave, absorb some of the sonic energy." He trailed off, thinking. Bull finished the thought. "Then we could shoot without telling every Japanese soldier within a mile where we are." Eddie looked at him with something between admiration and fear. "You're talking about modifying military equipment without authorization. That's a court-martial offense." Bull's response was simple. 11 American snipers have died in 9 days. I'd rather face a court-martial than watch number 12 get killed because we're too scared to break a regulation. That night, after Eddie fell asleep, Bull lay awake thinking about copper mines, about how the ventilation shafts used baffles to redirect airflow, how the stamp mills used dampening chambers to reduce noise that would otherwise deafen workers, about how sound was just compressed air moving through space, and if you could disrupt that movement, redirect it, absorb its energy, you could make it quieter. He'd seen the principle applied in mining equipment his entire childhood. The question was whether that same principle could be applied to a weapon designed to create a controlled explosion. The mathematics were beyond him, but the intuition felt right. Felt true in his gut, the way things sometimes did when you'd paid attention to patterns long enough. By the time dawn broke over the Finisterre Range, Bull Mackenzie had made a decision that would save hundreds of American lives and cost him nearly everything he'd thought military service meant. The supply depot at the rear echelon was a graveyard of broken equipment. Bull walked through it on a sweltering afternoon in late July, officially looking for replacement parts for damaged rifles, actually searching for materials that might solve a problem the army didn't even acknowledge existed. Eddie trailed behind, nervous, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds like they were committing a crime, which technically they were about to. The depot sergeant was a career man named Kowalski, 50 years old if he was a day, who'd seen every scam and scheme soldiers could devise. He watched Bull with suspicious eyes as the sniper examined a pile of damaged aircraft components, pieces of downed American planes that had been stripped for salvageable parts. Bull picked up a section of exhaust manifold from a P-38 Lightning, turned it over in his hands, felt the weight of it. The metal was scored and blackened, but the internal baffles were intact. Kowalski materialized at his elbow like a ghost. "That's aircraft salvage, Corporal, not rifle parts." Bull met his eyes without flinching. "Noticed you've got a still running behind the quartermaster tent. Copper tubing, yeast from the medical supplies, sugar requisitioned as medical necessity." Kowalski's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. "That's a serious accusation." Bull shrugged. "Not an accusation, just an observation. Same way I'm observing that this exhaust section is just scrap metal that nobody's going to miss." They stared at each other for 10 seconds that felt like an hour. Finally, Kowalski grunted. "Scrap metal gets written off as damaged beyond repair. I don't ask questions about what happens to it after that." Bull nodded. "Appreciate the clarity, Sergeant." By the time they got the manifold back to their position, Bull had also acquired a damaged ammunition can, 3 feet of steel cable, a ruined radio housing, and a mechanic's set of files that had somehow ended up in the salvage pile. Eddie spread the materials on their tarp and looked at Bull like he was insane. "This is junk. How are you planning to turn aircraft parts into a rifle suppressor?" Bull was already disassembling the exhaust manifold, examining how the baffles redirected hot gases through the chamber. The principle was sound. High-pressure gas enters the first chamber, deflects against an angled surface, loses velocity and pressure, enters a second chamber where the process repeats. By the time the gas exits, its energy is dispersed over time and space, instead of exploding outward in one violent burst. The challenge was adapting the concept to a rifle barrel, while maintaining accuracy and not destroying the weapon in the process. "See how these baffles are angled at 45 degrees? That's deliberate. Forces the gas to change direction, which costs energy. Same principle as a mineshaft ventilation baffle, just miniaturized." Eddie picked up one of the baffle sections, held it to the light. "Even if we can adapt this, we need something to absorb the acoustic energy. The baffles will disrupt the gas expansion, but we need dampening material for the sound waves themselves." That problem had been nagging Bull since he'd started thinking about the design. In mines, they used rock wool insulation and sometimes asbestos to dampen machinery noise. Here in the jungle, those materials were fantasy. He needed something heat-resistant, fibrous enough to absorb sound, and available from military supplies. The solution came from an unexpected source. That evening, during chow, Bull noticed the cook using heavy canvas gloves to handle hot pots. The gloves were layered canvas impregnated with some kind of fire-resistant compound, designed to withstand temperatures that would char normal fabric. He approached the cook, a heavy-set private from Louisiana named Dugas, who ran the field kitchen with benevolent tyranny. "Those gloves, what happens to them when they wear out?" Dugas looked up from stirring a pot of something that might have been stew in a previous life. "Burn 'em usually. Why, you cold in this 100-degree heat?" Bull ignored the sarcasm. "I need damaged gloves, as many as you can spare." Dugas studied him with the calculating look of someone who'd spent a career trading favors. "What's in it for me?" Bull considered this. "I bag wild pig next time I'm in the jungle. You get first choice of the meat before it goes to the officers." The cook's eyes lit up. Fresh meat was worth its weight in gold. "Deal. I got maybe 8 pairs that are too damaged for kitchen use. They're yours." That night, by the dim light of a shielded lantern, Bull and Eddie began the work that would occupy every spare moment for the next week. Using the files, Bull carefully cut the exhaust manifold into sections, separating the baffles while keeping their structural integrity intact. The work was painstaking. Too much force, and the thin metal would crumple. Too little, and the files wouldn't bite. His hands cramped after an hour. Eddie took over while Bull cut the damaged canvas gloves into strips, pulling apart the layers to separate the fire-resistant inner material. The fabric was tough, densely woven, impregnated with what smelled like borax or some other flame retardant. When Eddie held a strip to his nose and recoiled, Bull figured they'd found their acoustic dampening material. "Smells like death and chemicals had a baby," Eddie muttered. Bull was already calculating how many layers they'd need, how to pack them between the baffles without creating so much back pressure that the rifle would explode in his hands. Death and chemicals is what we're trying to avoid. This'll work. The basic design took shape over 3 nights. A cylindrical housing made from the ammunition can, carefully measured and cut to fit snugly over the rifle's barrel. Inside the housing, 5 baffle chambers made from the salvaged aircraft parts, each one angled to redirect gas flow and reduce pressure. Between each chamber, layers of treated canvas compressed tight enough to absorb sound, but loose enough to allow gas passage. The whole assembly would thread onto the rifle barrel using adapted components from the radio housing. In theory, when Bull fired, the bullet would travel through the device unimpeded, but the expanding gases behind it would be forced through the baffles, losing energy at each stage. The canvas would absorb the acoustic signature. The result should be a shot that sounded more like a sharp cough than a rifle report. Should be. Theory and reality had a nasty habit of diverging in the field. Eddie voiced the concern they were both thinking. If the back pressure is too high, the rifle could blow up in your hands. If it's too low, this won't suppress anything and you'll have just added 3 pounds of useless metal to your weapon, and if the baffles aren't aligned perfectly, you'll lose accuracy, which defeats the entire purpose. Bull had been thinking about those risks for days. Testing the device meant firing it, and firing it meant revealing what they'd built. Once the first shot was fired, there'd be no hiding their unauthorized modification. If it failed, he'd be court-martialed for destroying military equipment and endangering personnel. If it succeeded but officers disapproved, he'd be court-martialed for unauthorized weapons modification. The only scenario where he didn't face military prison was if the device worked so well that command couldn't ignore its tactical value. Those were not comfortable odds. But on the night of August 3rd, while Bull was carefully threading the suppressor onto his Springfield's barrel for the first time, Eddie brought news that made the risks irrelevant. 3 more American snipers had been killed that day, not by the ghost shooter they'd been hunting, but by ordinary Japanese infantry who'd heard the Americans' shots and triangulated their positions with brutal efficiency. The tally was now 14 American marksmen dead in 3 weeks. 14 men who'd done everything right according to training and doctrine, and died because that doctrine was inadequate for jungle warfare. Bull finished attaching the suppressor and held the modified rifle up to the dim light. It looked wrong, ungainly, with the cylindrical device extending the barrel by 15 inches. The balance was off. The weapon was front-heavy now, would require adjustment to his shooting stance and technique, but none of that mattered if it kept him alive long enough to kill the enemy. Eddie was watching him with an expression that mixed admiration and fear. "When are you going to test it?" Bull checked his watch. 200 hours. 4 hours until dawn. Now, while everyone's asleep and there's enough ambient jungle noise to mask whatever sound this thing makes. Eddie stood up, reaching for his gear. "I'm coming with you." Bull started to argue, then stopped. If the rifle exploded, it would be good to have someone who could drag his maimed body back to the aid station. If it worked, Eddie deserved to see the fruit of their collaboration. "Stay 20 yards back. If this goes wrong, no sense both of us getting killed." They moved into the jungle like shadows, away from the American perimeter, deeper into the green darkness where death waited patiently behind every tree. They moved through the jungle for 40 minutes, putting distance between themselves and the American perimeter. Bull chose his path carefully, following game trails where the undergrowth was thinner, where their passage wouldn't leave obvious signs. The moon was 3/4 full, providing enough light to navigate by once their eyes adjusted. Every 20 yards, Bull stopped and listened for Japanese patrols, for anything that suggested they weren't alone in the darkness. Eddie followed 10 paces behind, rifle ready, scanning their flanks. The jungle at night was a different creature than during the day. The bird calls ceased. The insects grew louder, their chorus reaching levels that seemed impossible. And underneath that insect symphony, Bull could hear other sounds. The distant rumble of artillery from the western front, the occasional crack of a falling branch, once the distinctive cough of a wild boar moving through the underbrush 50 yards to their left. They stopped in a natural depression surrounded by thick vegetation, far enough from any known Japanese position that the sound wouldn't draw immediate investigation, but close enough to American lines that they could reach safety if something went catastrophically wrong. Bull positioned himself prone, bracing the modified rifle against a fallen log. The suppressor added significant weight to the front end, throwing off the balance he'd spent months perfecting. He adjusted his grip, compensating for the new center of gravity, sighting through the scope at a dead tree trunk 20 yards distant. The tree had been lightning-struck months ago, its bark stripped away, the white wood underneath showing clearly in the moonlight. A perfect target. Eddie settled into position 15 yards behind and to the left, watching through binoculars, ready to observe the shot's effect. Bull's breathing steadied into the rhythm he'd developed through hundreds of rounds at the range and dozens of kills in combat. 4 seconds inhaling, 3 seconds holding, 5 seconds exhaling. At the bottom of the exhale, when his body was most still, when his heartbeat slowed to its minimum, he squeezed the trigger. The sensation was unlike anything he'd experienced. The rifle bucked against his shoulder with normal recoil. The suppressor didn't reduce that. Couldn't reduce that without compromising the bullet's velocity. But the sound was wrong in the best possible way. Instead of the sharp crack that could be heard for miles, there was a muted thump, like someone dropping a heavy book on a wooden floor. The suppressor had channeled the explosion's energy through the baffles, dispersing it, absorbing its acoustic signature through the layers of treated canvas. Bull's ears, accustomed to the punishing assault of unsuppressed rifle fire, barely registered the shot. He worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, chambering another round, fired again. Same muted thump. The white wood of the target tree showed 2 fresh holes, perfectly placed where Bull had aimed. 20 yards wasn't a test of accuracy. That would come later with longer shots, but it proved the most critical thing. The suppressor didn't catastrophically interfere with the bullet's trajectory. Eddie was staring at him with an expression of pure disbelief. That's it? That's all the sound? Bull was examining the suppressor, checking for structural damage, signs of excessive heat buildup, anything that suggested the device was failing. The metal was hot, but not dangerously so. The baffles had held their position. Fire one yourself. Tell me what you hear. Eddie took the rifle with reverent care, positioned himself, aimed at the same tree. When he fired, Bull listened with the focused attention of someone whose life might depend on accurately assessing this sound. The report was audible but muffled, lacking the sharp crack that carried through jungle air like a bell. At a distance of more than 100 yards, surrounded by the jungle's ambient noise, it would be nearly impossible to distinguish from natural sounds. A breaking branch, a falling coconut, the territorial dispute of some animal. The acoustic signature that had been killing American snipers had been reduced to a whisper. Eddie lowered the rifle, his hands shaking slightly. This changes everything. Every sniper in the division needs one of these. Every rifleman, if we can produce enough. Bull was already thinking about the implications, running through scenarios in his tactical mind. We can't mass-produce anything. We built this with salvage parts and stolen materials. Even if command approves the concept, it'll take months for the engineering corps to design, test, and manufacture standardized versions. By then, how many more Americans die? The question hung in the humid air between them. Eddie had no answer because there was no good answer. Innovation in wartime moved at the speed of bureaucracy, and bureaucracy measured time in quarters and fiscal years, not in daily casualty reports. They were preparing to return to camp when Bull heard it. The distinctive sound of metal striking metal, faint but unmistakable, coming from the northeast. He dropped flat instantly, Eddie following suit without question. Both men became motionless, scanning the darkness through their respective optics. Bull's scope showed nothing but vegetation and shadow. Then movement, 3 figures moving through the jungle with the careful deliberation of men who knew they were in enemy territory. Japanese patrol, maybe scouts, maybe a listening post returning to their lines. They were 100 yards away, moving roughly parallel to Bull and Eddie's position, not directly toward them, but close enough that any loud noise would draw investigation. Bull's finger rested beside the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself. He had 3 rounds in the magazine. Eddie had 5. Against 3 Japanese soldiers at close range in the jungle, those were acceptable odds if shooting became necessary. But shooting meant revealing their position, meant possibly compromising their return route to American lines, meant questions about why 2 soldiers were outside the perimeter at 0300 hours carrying a modified weapon that violated multiple regulations. The Japanese patrol moved with impressive discipline. They communicated through hand signals Bull could barely see in the moonlight. One man appeared to be an officer or senior NCO, directing the others with small gestures that spoke of extensive training and experience. These weren't conscripts or second-rate troops. These were professionals, and professionals were the most dangerous enemy. Bull watched them through his scope, tracking their movement, calculating firing solutions he hoped he wouldn't need to use. The lead soldier stopped suddenly, raising a hand. All 3 men froze. The leader tilted his head, listening. Bull's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he was certain the Japanese could hear it. What had they detected? Had the test shots carried further than he'd estimated? Had they left tracks visible even in the darkness? The Japanese leader gestured to one of his companions, who moved forward cautiously, examining something on the ground. Bull realized with cold certainty what they'd found: the spent brass casings from his test shots. He'd been so focused on the suppressor's acoustic performance that he'd forgotten the fundamental fieldcraft of policing his brass. 2 empty casings lying in the leaf litter, proof of recent American activity in an area that was supposed to be no man's land. The Japanese soldiers conferred in whispers Bull couldn't hear. One of them pointed toward the dead tree with its fresh bullet holes. They'd found the target, were reconstructing what had happened. 3 Americans, 2 shooters, and presumably a spotter, conducting what looked like weapons testing outside their perimeter. The tactical implications would be obvious to any competent enemy. Americans were developing something new, something that required field testing under operational conditions. That made this location tactically significant, made Bull and Eddie high-value targets whose capture would provide intelligence worth far more than 2 dead soldiers. The lead Japanese soldier made a decision. He gestured for his men to spread out, to begin searching the immediate area. They were going to sweep for the Americans they knew had to be nearby. Bull made eye contact with Eddie, jerked his head to the left. They needed to move, needed to create distance before the Japanese established a perimeter. Eddie nodded understanding. Both men began crawling backward, moving with agonizing slowness, placing each hand and knee carefully to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The Japanese were advancing, searching methodically, their rifles at the ready. Bull and Eddie had crawled maybe 30 yards when Eddie's boot caught on a vine. The vegetation rustled, not loudly, but in the near silence of pre-dawn jungle. Any sound was potentially fatal. The nearest Japanese soldier swiveled toward the noise, bringing his rifle to his shoulder. Bull had perhaps 2 seconds to decide. Let the soldier spot them, which would trigger a firefight at close range with uncertain outcome. Or take the shot now with the suppressed rifle, eliminate the immediate threat before it could alert the others. His decision was instinctive rather than calculated. The suppressor had been built for exactly this scenario. He brought the Springfield to his shoulder, found the Japanese soldier in his scope, centered the crosshairs on the man's chest, and fired. The muted thump was swallowed by jungle sounds. The soldier dropped without a sound, without understanding what had killed him. His 2 companions spun toward where he'd fallen, rifles searching for targets they couldn't identify. Bull was already working the bolt, chambering another round, but Eddie grabbed his arm and shook his head violently. Two men were searching for threats they couldn't locate. If Bull fired again, even with the suppressor, he'd give away their approximate position through muzzle flash, or some detail he couldn't predict. Better to remain frozen, let the Japanese find their dead companion, and hopefully withdraw to report, rather than press a search for an enemy who demonstrated the ability to kill silently from concealment. The two surviving soldiers found their fallen comrade, checked for pulse, for breathing, found nothing. They exchanged rapid conversation Bull couldn't translate, but whose tone he understood perfectly. Fear mixed with confusion. Their companion had been shot, that much was obvious from the wound, but neither man had heard a shot. In the combat logic they'd been trained in, silent death came from knives or strangling, not from rifles fired at distance. One soldier wanted to search further. The other, the leader, Bull thought, refused. Bull. He pointed toward the wound, then toward the dead tree with its bullet holes, making connections. Whatever they were developing here, the Americans had something that killed without sound. That information needed to reach command immediately was more valuable than attempting to engage an enemy who might kill them both before they heard the shots coming. The two Japanese withdrew rapidly, moving faster than tactical discipline usually permitted, putting distance between themselves and a threat they didn't understand. Bull and Eddie remained motionless for another 20 minutes, until the jungle sounds returned to normal, until they were certain the patrol had truly withdrawn. Only then did Bull allow himself to breathe fully. We need to get back now, before they mobilize a response, before dawn breaks. Eddie was staring at the spot where the Japanese soldier had fallen. You killed him, and they didn't know where it came from. Bull was already moving, heading back toward American lines. That's the point. That's why 14 Americans are dead, because every time we shoot, we announce ourselves. Not anymore. They reached the perimeter just as false dawn was lighting the eastern sky. The device that had started as desperate theory was now proven in the most definitive way possible, with enemy blood. Tomorrow would bring consequences Bull couldn't predict. But tonight had proven one thing absolutely. They'd found a way to kill silently in a war that had been screaming. Bull cleaned the suppressor with methodical care as first light broke over the Finisterre range. The metal was still warm from the night's firing. The canvas layers inside slightly singed, but intact. Eddie sat across from him on their top, equally silent, both men processing what had happened. They'd killed a Japanese soldier with a weapon that didn't announce itself, had escaped detection by the patrol, had proven their concept in the most unforgiving laboratory possible. Now came the harder part, deciding what to tell command. Bull's squad leader, Sergeant First Class McGraw, found them at 0700 hours. He was a career man from Tennessee, tough as boot leather and twice as mean when regulations were violated. Corporal Mackenzie, you were outside the perimeter last night. Care to explain why? Bull had prepared for this question during the hike back. Testing modified equipment, Sergeant. Needed operational distance from camp for safety reasons. McGraw's eyes narrowed dangerously. Modified equipment? You mean that monstrosity attached to your rifle that looks like someone welded a coffee can to the barrel? He'd noticed. Of course he'd noticed. McGraw noticed everything. It's a sound suppression device. Reduces acoustic signature by approximately 80%. Field tested successfully against enemy personnel at 0300 hours. The silence that followed was profound. McGraw stared at Bull like he'd announced he'd built a rocket to the moon. You built a suppressor. From what materials? Bull gestured to the disassembled components spread on the tarp. Aircraft salvage, damaged canvas gloves, ammunition can. Total cost to the Army, 0. The parts were all written off as unsalvageable. McGraw picked up one of the baffle sections, examined it with a mechanic's eye. He'd worked on farm equipment before the war, understood how things fit together. This is brilliant and completely unauthorized. You know what happens to soldiers who modify military equipment without approval, Corporal? Bull met his eyes without flinching. I know what happens to soldiers who keep dying because their rifles announce their position every time they fire. 14 in 3 weeks, Sergeant. I'm trying to make it so I'm not number 15. Something shifted in McGraw's expression. He'd been in combat long enough to know that regulations written by officers in rear echelon didn't always match reality in the field. "Stay here. Don't talk to anyone. Don't show that device to anyone. I need to brief the lieutenant." He left at a pace just short of running. 20 minutes later, Bull and Eddie were standing at attention in Lieutenant Harrison's tent. The officer was young, maybe 24, a college graduate from Pennsylvania who'd been at the front for 6 weeks. He examined the suppressor with intense curiosity, turning it over in his hands. "Explain how this works, Corporal." Bull walked him through the design, the baffle system, the acoustic dampening material, the gas expansion principles. Harrison listened without interrupting, his intelligence evident in how quickly he grasped the concepts. When Bull finished, the lieutenant set the suppressor down carefully. "You understand this violates approximately 6 different regulations: modification of military equipment, unauthorized use of salvaged materials, conducting weapons tests outside the perimeter without clearance. I could have you court-martialed and probably should." Bull said nothing. There was nothing to say. Harrison continued, "However, you've also potentially solved a problem that's killing our snipers. I need to see this demonstrated, now, under controlled conditions." They spent the next hour at the firing range while Bull demonstrated the suppressor's capabilities. 50 rounds at distances from 50 to 300 yards. Every shot was muted, audible but dramatically quieter than standard rifle fire. More importantly, accuracy remained consistent. The modified weapon shot true. Harrison watched through binoculars as Bull put 10 rounds into a 6-inch group at 200 yards. Finally, he lowered the binoculars and turned to McGraw. "How many of these can we build?" McGraw understood the question's implications. "With Corporal Mackenzie supervising construction. Maybe 3 per week if we dedicate men to scavenging proper materials. More if we can get engineering support." Harrison made his decision with the swift certainty of someone who understood that perfect solutions didn't exist in combat. "McGraw, assign 2 men to work with Mackenzie. I want 5 more suppressors built within 10 days. Calabresi, you're now officially Mackenzie's assistant armorer. Mackenzie, you're temporarily reassigned from combat operations to weapons development, effective immediately." Bull felt something twist in his chest. He'd built the suppressor to hunt the Japanese sniper who'd killed 11 Americans, not to spend his war in a workshop. "Sir, with respect, my job is killing the enemy, not building equipment." Harrison's response was sharp. "Your job, Corporal, is whatever I tell you it is. Right now, that's building devices that will keep other snipers alive long enough to kill the enemy. Consider it a direct order." That afternoon, word spread through the division like wildfire. Mackenzie had built something that let you shoot without giving away your position. Officers who dismissed Bull as too cautious suddenly wanted demonstrations. Snipers who'd considered him lucky now understood his survival had been skill combined with tactical patience. And the Japanese, monitoring American radio communications, began to report disturbing developments. Their soldiers were dying from rifle fire that made no sound, killed from positions that couldn't be identified. By evening, Bull had requisition orders for materials that officially didn't exist and assignment of personnel to a project that had no official designation. The bureaucracy was already consuming his innovation, transforming it from desperate field modification into something that would eventually carry serial numbers and technical specifications. Eddie found him after chow, sitting alone near the perimeter, staring toward the mountains where the Japanese ghost sniper still operated. "You did it. You built something that's going to save lives." Bull nodded slowly. "Yeah. And now I'll never get the chance to hunt the bastard who killed those 11 men. I'll spend the rest of my war in a workshop while he keeps killing." Eddie had no answer to that because they both knew it was probably true. Innovation came with costs that couldn't be calculated in production schedules or casualty reductions. Sometimes the cost was personal, measured in missions never undertaken and enemies never faced. That night, Bull lay awake listening to the distant sounds of combat. wondering if his suppressor would reach the frontline snipers before the Japanese Ghost claimed victim number 12. Over the next 12 days, Bull's unauthorized workshop became the most visited location in the division. He worked 18-hour days, training 2 privates, Carson from Iowa and Liu from California, in the precise art of baffle construction and canvas preparation. The process couldn't be rushed. Each suppressor required exact measurements, careful metalwork, and testing that consumed precious ammunition. Carson had blacksmith experience and understood heat treatment of metal. Liu had worked in his father's upholstery shop and knew fabric like Bull knew rifle mechanisms. Together they formed an unlikely production line that transformed salvage into survival equipment. By September 3rd, they'd completed 7 suppressors. All 7 were distributed to the division's most experienced snipers. Men with the discipline to understand that the device wasn't magic, was simply tactical advantage that required adjustment to shooting technique and maintenance discipline. The suppressors needed cleaning after every 30 rounds. The canvas dampening material degraded with heat and moisture. Soldiers who neglected maintenance found their devices failing at critical moments. But those who treated them properly discovered they could operate in ways previously impossible. Sergeant Cole was the first to report success. Operating in the Ramu Valley, he'd eliminated a Japanese observation post, 3 soldiers manning a position that had been directing mortar fire onto American advances for 6 days. 3 shots, 3 kills, no return fire because the Japanese never identified where death was coming from. Cole's report noted something Bull had suspected but couldn't prove until now. The psychological impact on the enemy was as significant as the physical casualties. Japanese soldiers were beginning to fear areas where Americans operated with suppressed weapons, were hesitating before moving through certain sectors, were requesting reassignment from positions where silent death had claimed their comrades. Fear was spreading through enemy ranks like disease, and fear made soldiers careless, made them vulnerable in ways that couldn't be quantified in after-action reports. Captain Reynolds, the division intelligence officer, summoned Bull on September 7th. "Corporal, we've intercepted Japanese communications. They're calling your suppressors ghost weapons. They think we've developed some kind of advanced technology, possibly experimental ammunition or electromagnetic pulse systems. They don't understand it's just clever engineering with salvaged parts." Bull found no satisfaction in this information. While he built suppressors, the Japanese sniper who'd started this entire chain of events continued operating. 2 more American marksmen had died since Bull's reassignment, both killed by perfectly placed shots from positions that couldn't be identified. The Ghost was still hunting, still perfecting his craft, and Bull wasn't there to hunt him back. McGraw noticed Bull's frustration during evening inspection. The sergeant pulled him aside after dismissing the others. "You're angry you're not in the field, I get it. But you need to understand something, Mackenzie. Every suppressor you build multiplies your effectiveness. You could kill maybe 2, 3 enemy soldiers a week personally. But the 7 suppressors you've already built, they've accounted for 23 confirmed enemy kills in 4 days. You're winning this war more effectively here than you ever could through a rifle scope." The logic was sound, but it didn't ease the knot in Bull's chest. Mathematics didn't capture what he'd lost, the clarity of purpose that came from hunting an enemy who'd earned his focused hatred, the satisfaction of applying skill against a worthy opponent, the simple equation of 1 man, 1 rifle, 1 mission. On September 10th, everything changed. Bull was testing suppressor number 9 when Lieutenant Harrison arrived with news that drove every other thought from Bull's mind. "The Japanese sniper hit another position this morning, killed Corporal Davidson at 400 yards, single shot, perfect placement, no indication where it came from. Davidson had been a decent man from Oregon, methodical and careful, not reckless, not careless, just unlucky enough to be visible for 3 seconds, which was all the Ghost needed." Harrison continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Division wants this sniper eliminated. They're authorizing a hunter-killer team. 2 snipers, 2 spotters, complete tactical freedom to operate however necessary. I'm recommending you lead it. Bull felt his pulse accelerate. "Sir, I thought my assignment was weapons development." Harrison's expression was grim. It was. "But Davidson's death makes it clear we need our best man hunting this ghost. You built the suppressors. You understand their tactical application better than anyone. And frankly, Corporal, you're the only sniper in this division who's patient enough to wait this bastard out." McGraw was nodding agreement. "Carson and Liu can handle production now. You've trained them well enough. They don't need you standing over their shoulders anymore." Bull looked at the suppressor in his hands, the device that had consumed 12 days of his life, that represented his greatest contribution to the war effort. Then he thought of Davidson, of the 11 men before him, of the Japanese sniper who killed with impunity while Americans died, following doctrine that didn't work. "When do we leave, sir?" Harrison checked his watch. "Dawn tomorrow. Choose your partner. I'm assigning you Calabresi as spotter since you've worked together. The other pair will be Cole and his spotter Bennett. 4 men against 1. Those odds should be sufficient." Bull thought about the ghost sniper, about patience and discipline and the hunt he'd been preparing for since July. 4 against 1 seemed like comfortable odds until you remembered that one had killed 13 Americans without ever being located. Until you remembered that this enemy thought in the same patient, deliberate patterns that Bull did, was possibly better at the craft than Bull would ever be. Until you remembered that in the jungle, numbers meant nothing if the enemy saw you first. "Sufficient," Bull repeated, testing the word. It felt hollow. In his experience, sufficient was what you hoped for before reality taught you that war didn't care about sufficient. War cared about who made the first critical mistake, and Bull had no intention of being that person. Bull Mackenzie moved into the Finisterre Range on September 11, 1943, carrying the suppressed rifle that had started as desperate theory and become proven innovation. For the next 23 days, he hunted the Japanese sniper through terrain where death whispered instead of screamed. The ghost was good, had survived months of American attempts to eliminate him, but he'd never faced an opponent who could shoot without announcing his position. On October 4th at dawn, Bull found him, a Japanese sergeant named Takashi, as patient and disciplined as Bull himself, positioned in a palm tree 60 feet above the jungle floor. The shot that killed him made almost no sound. Takashi never knew what hit him, never understood that the American he'd been hunting had learned to hunt silently. Bull's suppressor claimed its most important target, and the reign of terror that had killed 13 Americans ended with a whisper instead of a scream. The ghost gun, as soldiers called it, would save an estimated 300 American lives before war's end. Bull built 47 more suppressors before his discharge in 1945. The Army classified his design for 37 years, finally acknowledging his innovation in 1980 when suppressor technology became standard doctrine. Bull never spoke publicly about his invention, never sought recognition, never claimed credit for changing how snipers fought in the Pacific. When asked years later why he'd risked court-martial to build an unauthorized device, his answer was simple. 14 men died because we were too loud. I made us quieter. That's all. Thomas Bull Mackenzie died in 1989 at 71 in a veterans hospital in Montana. His obituary mentioned World War II service and a Bronze Star, but nothing about the innovation that revolutionized sniper warfare. The suppressor he'd built from aircraft salvage and canvas gloves now sits in the Army's Ordnance Museum, labeled with technical specifications but no inventor's name. Sometimes the men who change wars remain as silent as the devices they create, and sometimes that silence is exactly what they fought to preserve. Bull understood that better than anyone. He'd learned in the jungles of New Guinea that the deadliest sound in combat wasn't gunfire. It was the silence that came before the shot no one heard coming.